In early 2007, inside a secure briefing room in Kabul, a senior American counterterrorism planner reportedly dismissed a British assessment with a line that would later circulate privately across allied intelligence channels. "The British are overreading the tribes again." The comment was not made for effect. It reflected a real institutional divide. By that stage of the war in Afghanistan, the United States had built the most powerful technical intelligence architecture in the theater. Drones over Helmand, signals collection tied to regional fusion cells, biometric exploitation, targeting databases, aerial pattern analysis, and a rapidly expanding special operations machine. The British had less money, fewer aircraft, fewer analysts, and far fewer people. What they had instead was a style of field intelligence that the Americans often considered old-fashioned until it started being right. The dispute centered on Helmand province, especially the belt around Sangin, Gerishk, and the Upper Green Zone. American planners increasingly treated the insurgency as a target network that could be reduced through persistent surveillance, raid cycles, phone exploitation, and kinetic pressure. British officers working with MI6, defense intelligence, and field surveillance teams argued that the insurgency in Helmand was not just a military web. It was a social ecosystem built from land, irrigation, tribe, opium, revenge, and local bargaining. Kill one commander without understanding his kinship obligations, and two cousins might replace him by Friday. Pay the wrong intermediary, and half a district would lie to you for a month. The British warning was not abstract. Between late 2006 and mid-2007, British reporting from Helmand repeatedly emphasized that the Taliban's resilience in the province came less from ideology than from embedded local arrangements. Some village elders were cooperating by day and facilitating movement by night. Some police chiefs were drawing coalition salaries while quietly taxing smuggling routes used by insurgent couriers. Several coalition detention targets, thought by American analysts to be mid-level militants, were in reality mediators whose removal would destabilize districts already hanging by threads. That distinction mattered. One side was building kill lists. The other was mapping the fabric that kept the war coherent. The Americans were not blind. They had excellent officers, extraordinary collection, and in many cases correct instincts. But the pace and scale of U.S. operations often favored action over texture. British reporting, especially from Helmand task force elements, tended to move more slowly at first and then arrive with an uncomfortable degree of precision. In meetings, the Americans asked how many fighters were in a valley. The British asked which canal owner fed them, which family sheltered them, and which grievance had turned a neutral village into an armed one. That difference would become impossible to ignore during one of the most important intelligence contests of the Afghan War. The fight to understand why Sangin remained so deadly even when coalition surveillance seemed to see everything. The answer, when it came, did not emerge from a drone feed or a signal sweep. It came from a British penetration of the human terrain that the larger American system had struggled to read in time. By the end of 2007, American officers in Regional Command South were still publicly confident that network pressure and ISR density would eventually break the insurgent system in central Helmand. Privately, some had begun to notice something harder to admit. The British were seeing the war from inside. The Americans were often still seeing it from above. Sangin earned its reputation in blood. By 2007, it was already one of the deadliest districts in Afghanistan for British forces. A place of irrigation ditches, mud compounds, walled fields, poppy wealth, family feuds, and ambush geometry that favored the side with patience. Too many American planners outside Helmand, Sangin looked like an insurgent stronghold that required more pressure, more surveillance, and more aggressive disruption. To British officers on the ground, it looked worse than that. It looked organized. British military reporting from Helmand during that period repeatedly highlighted the degree to which violence, in Sangin was structured through local systems, rather than simply directed from distant Taliban command. Route denial, intimidation, IED emplacement, sanctuary, and warning networks were not random acts by isolated fighters. They were tied to canal access, narcotics profits, tribal suballiances, mosque influence, and the choices of power brokers who shifted loyalties when it suited them. The district functioned less like a guerrilla battlefield than like a machine in which every local grievance could be turned into tactical effect. American intelligence systems were good at detecting activity. They could identify compounds of interest, correlate signals, track movement patterns, and support extraordinary direct action raids. But they often struggled to answer the question that mattered most in Sangin. Why did the same villages produce fighters after repeated kinetic disruption? British analysts and field officers increasingly argued that the answer lay in coercion mixed with consent. Certain villages were not pro-Taliban in a simple ideological sense. They were trapped inside arrangements maintained by fear, economics, and kinship enforcement. If those arrangements remained intact, tactical success would evaporate faster than the daily reporting cycle could admit. The British advantage was not magic. It came from fieldcraft, continuity, and an institutional habit of treating intelligence as social cartography rather than merely target development. Helmand reporting benefited from officers and attached specialists who spent less time searching for a clean enemy hierarchy and more time tracing obligation. Which Malik could still influence the canal laborers? Which police commander was taking money from both the government and the traffickers? Which subtribe had lost land in an irrigation dispute and had therefore turned its sons toward the insurgency? In a place like Sangin, those details were not background. They were operational facts. Around this time, British reporting began to converge on a specific assessment. A cluster of facilitators in and around Sangin was coordinating both insurgent movement and selective cooperation with corrupt local officials. This was not simply a Taliban commander problem. It was an access problem. Fighters moved because local gatekeepers allowed movement. I-Team survived because warning chains shielded them. Coalition intentions leaked because men inside the state were quietly feeding them outward. Some American officers regarded the British picture as overly anthropological, too soft around the edges, too focused on nuance when force and speed were required. But British intelligence teams were beginning to produce something harder than nuance. They were identifying the connective tissue that made the battlefield regenerate. By late 2007, one British-led source chain and a parallel surveillance effort had started to expose a district-level mechanism linking insurgent logistics, narcotics taxation, and compromised local authority. If that mechanism could be mapped clearly enough, it would explain why Sangin kept bleeding men and still refusing to break. By 2008, coalition ISR over Helmand had become formidable. Unmanned aircraft-tracked compounds, road junctions, canal crossings, and suspected meeting sites. Signals intelligence fed targeting cells at speed. Captured media from raids generated names, numbers, and links. The Americans had built a machine capable of finding patterns almost anywhere. What remained difficult was distinguishing tactical noise from strategic truth. This was where British human reporting began to matter disproportionately. MI6 linked channels, military interpreters with deep local access, and British field intelligence teams in Helmand were piecing together a view of Sangin that often cut against U.S. assumptions. The insurgency's resilience was not primarily being sustained by a hidden stream of foreign fighters or by a simple command hierarchy radiating from Pakistan. It was being sustained by local compacts. Men who publicly backed the government were privately permitting insurgent taxation. Families who denied Taliban presence were hosting bomb makers because they feared losing irrigation rights. Some Afghan officials accepted coalition money by morning and passed route warnings by night. Several of these insights aligned with broader public scholarship and later official analysis of Helmand. including the role of local patronage systems, competition over land and water, and the destabilizing effect of misunderstood tribal politics. But at the time, in the pressure of active operations, the contrast between British and American methods was sharper. U.S. targeting often emphasized who could be fixed, tracked, and hit. British reporting put more weight on who could not be understood without entering local social reality first, one British field officer later discussed in secondary accounts of Helmand operations, reportedly argued that coalition intelligence in Sangin was too often counting the symptom and missing the source. The phrase stuck because it described the problem exactly. The Americans could count the IED attacks, identify the blast signatures, recover fragments, and fly the routes. The British wanted to know which landlord's grievance, which police betrayal, or which smuggling obligation had made those devices possible in the first place. That difference shaped operations. British teams pushed harder for long contact source handling, smaller meetings, and slower cultivation of village-level intermediaries. Americans tended to prefer collection that scaled, more persistent surveillance, more fusion, more immediate exploitation. Both approaches produced results, but one repeatedly proved better at exposing the invisible bargains that allowed the insurgency to survive pressure. By mid-2008, British reporting tied parts of Sangin's violence to a set of local brokers who were not obvious battlefield leaders. They were mediators, facilitators, contractors, district fixers, and men with family links stretching across nominally hostile camps. They controlled access to roads, labor, and silence. Hit a bomb maker, and another could be found. Break a facilitator network, and whole sections of the district might briefly stop making sense to the insurgency. This was the point at which some American officers began to reassess British methods, though not always publicly. Their systems had the scale. The British seemed to have the key. In Helmand, scale alone was not enough. You could watch a valley all day and still miss the single handshake that turned surveillance into understanding. The credibility gap narrowed when British assessments about local compromise and infiltration were repeatedly validated in operational reality. One of the most important recurring themes in Helmand reporting during these years was the persistent weakness and divided loyalty of Afghan local institutions. Public reporting, memoir literature, and later strategic analysis all converged on the same hard truth: corruption, patronage, and fear shaped the battlefield as much as firepower did. British officers had been sounding that warning early and often. What made the British position increasingly persuasive was not rhetorical skill. It was predictive accuracy. They were often right before events proved them right. Village leaders described as cooperative in broad coalition reporting turned out to be passing information to insurgents. Local officials treated as useful partners were later implicated in protection schemes or narcotics-linked arrangements. Some channels that Americans hoped to use for stabilization turned out to be precisely the conduits through which insurgent influence moved. Sangin and wider Helmand also exposed the limits of heavily centralized intelligence culture. U.S. officers had to satisfy larger bureaucratic structures, synchronize across agencies, and often seek validation through multiple forms of collection before major judgments carried institutional weight. British field reporting, while hardly free from bureaucracy, often allowed more latitude for local interpretation and faster acceptance of human nuance that mattered in a district where windows of relevance closed quickly and where formal confirmation often arrived after the village had already changed sides again. American Special Operations units, once given a fuller picture, could be devastatingly effective. This is an important part of the story. The point was not that the British were superior in every domain. It was that British human terrain understanding often made coalition force more intelligent. When U.S. units acted on richer local insight, their operations improved. The frustration came from how long that recognition sometimes took. A broader strategic lesson emerged. In Helmand, intelligence was not just about finding targets. It was about interpreting the environment correctly enough that tactical action did not feed strategic confusion. Arrest the wrong elder, and a canal network could swing hostile. Back the wrong police chief, and a district center could become an insurgent warning post wearing a government badge. Accept the wrong local narrative, and months of collection would be bent around a lie. By late 2008 and into 2009, the best American officers in theater increasingly understood this. Some began to borrow more from the British approach: longer immersion, deeper local mapping, more skepticism toward polished intermediaries, and more attention to district-specific human realities. The British had not won Helmand in any neat sense. No one could honestly claim that. But they had identified something the Americans initially resisted. The war in places like Sangin could not be solved from altitude alone. The men who once dismissed British reporting as tribal romanticism were now reading it more carefully. Sometimes because operations had already proved the cost of ignoring it. What made the British performance in Helmand difficult for some Americans to digest was not merely that it was effective. It was that it challenged several assumptions the U.S. system preferred to make about modern intelligence. The first assumption was that superior collection infrastructure would naturally produce superior understanding. In many environments, that was broadly true. In Helmand, it was incomplete. Drones could see movement. They could not explain obligation. Signals could reveal contact. They could not fully reveal why one family would risk everything to preserve that contact. The second assumption was that bigger organizations, with more analysts, more platforms, and more resources, would inevitably outlearn smaller ones. Yet British influence in Helmand often came from the opposite model: fewer people, narrower focus, thicker local reading, and a stronger willingness to trust field judgment. That trust did not guarantee success, but when it worked, it compressed the distance between observation and decision. The third assumption was cultural. Many Americans believed their coalition partners, including the British, brought valuable military skill, but not necessarily a better intelligence method. Helmand complicated that belief. Britain's long institutional memory in the region, combined with habits formed in places like Northern Ireland, Oman, and other irregular environments, produced an approach that was less dazzled by technical abundance and more alert to hidden social mechanics. The British were not better because they were mystical or braver. They were often better because they entered messy local systems without expecting them to become legible on American terms. This advantage could be overstated, and serious British officers would have been the first to admit their own failures in Helmand. They were not omniscient. They made bad calls, misread people, and paid for it. But when the issue was understanding the interaction of kinship, grievance, local power, and insurgent adaptation, they often saw the shape of the problem earlier. By 2009, enough evidence had accumulated that the contrast was no longer anecdotal. The coalition struggle in Helmand had shown repeatedly that tactical superiority did not automatically produce political or intelligence superiority. Some of the most dangerous misunderstandings in the campaign came from mistaking data richness for local comprehension. In district after district, relationships outran systems. That was the quiet professional conclusion many Americans reached, even if it rarely appeared in official language. The British were not succeeding because they ignored risk. They were succeeding because their institutions had been built through long and often ugly imperial and post-imperial experience to treat risk, culture, and human contact as the real terrain of a regular war. In Helmand, that often made the difference between seeing insurgency and actually understanding how it reproduced itself. The final lesson was not that the British were always right and the Americans usually wrong. That would be lazy, and history is not that neat. The real lesson was harder and more useful. In Afghanistan, particularly in Helmand, the most powerful technical intelligence system in the world repeatedly needed help from an ally with fewer resources but sharper local instincts. The British could not have replaced American scale. The Americans could not easily replicate British texture. Where the coalition worked best, those strengths reinforced each other. Where they clashed, the enemy often benefited. Helmand became one of the clearest demonstrations of a truth intelligence professionals know, but institutions keep forgetting. Irregular war is not solved by collection alone. It is solved when collection meets interpretation, and interpretation is usually carried by people close enough to the ground to feel how power actually moves. In Sengen, Gerishk, and the wider Green Zone. That meant understanding which elder feared whom, which police checkpoint had already been bought, which canal route belonged to which family, and which ally was balancing three loyalties at once. The British contribution mattered because it revealed the hidden architecture inside what looked to outsiders like chaos. They showed, again and again, that violence in Helmand was not random turbulence. It was organized through human systems. Once you understood those systems, different choices became possible. Some targets became less urgent. Some intermediaries became more dangerous. Some villages that looked hostile from the air became intelligible on the ground. American officers who learned that lesson became better operators for it. Many did. Some of the strongest U.S. performances later in the war came from formations that absorbed more of this local intelligence discipline and stopped treating social complexity as an obstacle to be simplified away. That adaptation deserves credit. So does the ally whose methods helped force it. If the story has a sting, it lies here. The United States entered Afghanistan believing, not without reason, that its intelligence power was unmatched. In raw capability, it was. But capability is not the same as comprehension. In Helmand, the British repeatedly demonstrated that a smaller service with deeper habits of human reading could outrun a larger system in the one area that mattered most. Knowing what the war actually meant at village level before the next operation began. That is why the British-American contrast in Afghanistan remains so revealing. It was never just about budgets, drones, or personalities. It was about the philosophies of intelligence meeting the same battlefield. One looked down and saw patterns. The other walked in and found the reason for them.